look at compensation. This is in Chapter 5 of the Employer Manual. Compensation. Now, it's payments made to the employees by the employer. Its contribution rate will be applied only to payments that are defined as compensation for ASRS purposes. We're going to go into more detail here now what that is. Compensation will be slightly different based on when your membership began with the Arizona State Retirement System. So let's look at the 3 criteria. You're looking at your staff membership. For those that started membership contributing prior to January 1st, 1984, we refer to them sometimes as pre-84. Then you have employees that started their membership January 1st, 84 through December 31, 2019. We refer to them as pre-20. And then any employee that started contributing January 1st, 2020 going forward. Now, these items are for all employees, all 3 criteria. Base pay would be considered compensation for ASRS. Balance of contract, that would be in the school systems. Sometimes school teachers would like checks be paid to them over the summer. They're working the 9 months in May, and over the summer they would like the employer to give them checks to help them balance their budgets and pay for things over the summer. Paid leave, sick, vacation, personal time off. That is considered compensation for ASRS, and you would take contributions out of it. Performance pay, regardless of when it was received by the member employee, that's considered compensation. Standby and on-call pay is also. Military differential pay. What this would be, for example, is let's say you have an individual that's paid $40,000 a year. They go off to active status in the military. They go overseas somewhere, and the military pays them $30,000. You as an employer may have a policy that you're willing to pay them the difference, additional $10,000 to help them budget at home. That $10,000 additional is the differential pay. That would be compensation for ASRS purposes. Also, pay received in excess of the base pay. This could be night shift, specific time, physical hardship, hazardous duty, a specific assignment. You may have an assignment that's going to last for a month. It's additional work, additional pay. That's considered compensation. And overtime is considered compensation for ASRS purposes. If you ever have a situation where you have an employee that you're no longer going to keep with you, there's some type of situation, and you go through some legal action, there's a settlement, and you're going to pay a sum of money to that individual, the retirement system would want you to first send a copy of that settlement agreement through the secure messaging to the Arizona State Retirement System, and you could make it attention to employer relations. We will review it and forward it to our legal department to make sure how that settlement is done is considered compensation for ASRS purposes. The reason we ask you to do this is because in the past we've had some employers just think that it's compensation, send it off to us, and we determine that it's not, and we have the employer having to take a credit back on it. So it's best to contact us to make that determination first. Now that we have talked about what is compensation for all 3 categories, now let's look at the category of employees that are before January 1st, 2020. Deferred payment. And this also includes employer-only payments. And what we're specifically talking about is if the employer is putting money in deferred comp, or if the employer is putting money into an account that bypasses the employee's payroll, they're specifically put into an employer-only deposit. Under the Arizona Supreme Court, that ruling is considered compensation for ASRS purposes, and you would need to take out both the employee and the employer contributions out of that. Non-accountable allowances. This would be, for example, if on a payroll basis or maybe once a month, you put additional money in an employee's payroll for cell phone expenses or maybe vehicle expenses, but the individual employee does not have to file a claim to get that money added or that reimbursement. We refer to that as non-accountable allowances. And for employees that started contributing before January 1st, 2020, that is considered compensation, and you would take that out, the contributions out for us. Mandatory payout of unused sick leave. An example of this would be, let's say you allow employees to carry over 200 hours for their leave. Anything over that across the board for all employees, that's going to be cashed out and paid out to the members. If you do have that policy, then any of those additional hours above the 200 mandatory policy that's being paid out would be considered compensation for ASRS, and you would withhold retirement contributions. Again, that's for before January 1st, 2020 members. Now, if the money is being paid out because they're going to be terminating, we refer to that as termination pay, and those individuals, that would not be considered compensation for ASRS purposes. Now, after saying that, there is one qualifier. For those members, employees that started before January 1st, 1984, that termination pay would be considered compensation for ASRS purposes. So if you're getting someone close to the end of their career and they have a balance of sick leave or vacation time and you're cashing that out to them to close the books, that you can give us contributions for that to reflect that money that's being paid out to them. But again, it's for those who started working prior to 1984. Now let's look at what is not compensation for ASRS purposes. One of them here is the health insurance opt-out, referred to as a fringe benefit. An example of this would be, let's say you have an employee that's working and they have a spouse working in the private sector and they're on their spouse's health insurance. So the fact they're on the spouse's health insurance and they're not on your employer health insurance, that's saving you some money. And some employers will give them a little extra money in their paycheck because they don't have this bigger expense that the employer has for having you on their health insurance. That additional money you're putting in their paycheck is considered a fringe benefit, and that is not compensation for ASRS purposes. Another one is the leave time sellback or buyback. Some employers, as someone's approaching to leave the employer and go into retirement, generally, they start what they call buyback their sick leave. It's being paid back to them over time. And that would not be considered compensation for ASRS purposes unless they started membership prior to 1984. And then we have reimbursements. The difference between this and the other program is this is where you have to file a claim. So an example is someone's traveling for business and they're paying for lunch, dinners, or hotel stays, and they have to file a claim. Then this is referred to as reimbursements, and it is not compensation for ASRS purposes. Short-term disability payments is not considered compensation. And again, termination pay as we define it is only compensation if someone started their membership prior to January 1st, 1984. Now let's look at employer termination incentive programs. You'll find this detailed in Chapter 5 in the Employer Manual. The Termination Incentive Program, or also referred to as TIP, is defined under Arizona Revised Statute 38749. The purpose of this law was to help mitigate any actual unfunded liability the ASRS may incur when employers are offering some type of incentives for employees to leave and possibly go into retirement sooner than was anticipated by the Arizona State Retirement System. Now, the Arizona State Retirement System, on a fiscal year basis, uses actuaries to determine how many people on average will go into retirement, how many people may go on long-term disability, and how many people may pass away and benefits paid out to survivors. Whenever an employer may do something that may cause a group of individuals or one individual to leave sooner than anticipated by our actuaries, we're now not prepared for that funded liability, and it could put more pressure on the ASRS and the contribution rates. There are two different approaches that we look at in the law. One of them is, the first one is if anything of value is provided by the employer. This could be, you have a group of individuals that are approaching retirement age. They may not really retire until next year or the following year, but you're going to offer them free health care until their Medicare age. And this group of individuals in your agency or school district say, wonderful, we'll do this. If you do that, this group has now decided to retire sooner than was anticipated, because maybe their normal retirement wasn't going to be for another year, but they opted to do this because you offered this value to them. Now, one thing you can do as an employer is if you feel you want to offer some type of benefit like this to your employees, you can, through secure messaging, send us a draft of what you propose. Our employer relations will review that and run it by our actuaries, and then we can determine if it will be any type of liability to you, the employer, even before you commit to doing it. But if you decide to go through with it and you want to do this, then you'll need to provide this information, the detailed information of all the individuals that are impacted. We'll calculate a cost for you, and then we'll actually bill you for that liability. Now, the other piece of this is we look at any increase in compensation at 30% or more. So each employee, as they go into retirement, we're going to look at the salaries that we use to calculate their monthly pension. And again, if any one of those hits 30% or more, we're going to reach out to the employer and ask them, was this increase in salary due to a promotion or not? If the employer says it was due to a promotion, then we leave it the way it is. If it's not due to a promotion, then it would be subject to that termination incentive program. The retirement system would calculate an unfunded liability and bill the employer for that cost. Your responsibility, you want to notify us before you implement that again. So you can send us a rough draft of that information, and if we give you a cost and you decide not to do it, you don't have to submit it. You don't have to commit to this. We may ask you for additional information in determining if there is going to be a liability or not. And again, if there is a liability, you'll have to submit that payment that's due to the Arizona State Retirement.